Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the June iteration of the webinar series called New War and Peace. And today's conversation is focused on the recent parliamentary elections in Armenia and their connection and link with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and Armenia-Azerbaijani relations. My name is Phil Gamaghelyan. I'm an assistant professor at the Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, an editor at Caucasus Edition. And joining us today are two returning panelists who, those of you who followed the webinars had seen before, of course, but also I'm sure are aware of their work well outside of the webinar series as well. We have Zaur Shiriyev, a South Caucasus analyst at the International Crisis Group, and Asbed Kotchikian, associate professor at the American University of Armenia and advisory board member at Caucasus Edition. But the usual disclaimer is that everybody is invited to speak in their personal capacity rather than representing the organizations they work for. And a few words about the format. We shortened it a bit. So in the past few webinars were an hour and a half. Today we will try a new format, which is 1 hour long. We will have an interactive discussion between Asbed, Zaur, and me for the first 40 minutes or so, followed by a question and answer session. So if you submitted the questions when registering, thank you very much. We will try to answer as many of them as possible. Some of them were about the predictions for the election results submitted early. That probably already is not relevant, but so those that connect more to the question of what now, we will address. And if you didn't send and are interested in sending questions as we speak or things come up that you want to follow up with from the speakers, please click the Q&A button at the bottom right of your screens and post the question there. Also, if you want just to send a comment, which is not a question, you can use the chat button, which I believe is accessible to, or visible rather, to the speakers and myself, and I'm afraid not the rest of the audience. So be aware of that when posting the comments. So without further ado, let me turn to the content of the conversation. Following the war in September, November of 2020, Armenia, as we all know, went to a prolonged political crisis. The opposition forces led by primarily by the former leaders of Armenia were demanding the resignation of Pashinyan and his team since they couldn't prevent the war and lost the war. So that crisis led eventually to the snap parliamentary elections, which for a long time looked very competitive. And all the opinion polls seem to indicate that the result will be very close between Pashinyan's party and the main challenger, an alliance led by former President Robert Kotchikian. And perhaps there will be no clean winner, there might be second round and further crisis. Yet, surprisingly, for most observers that I'm aware of, the elections delivered a rather decisive result and a pretty clear victory for Pashinyan's party, or perhaps a clear loss to the opposition. So I want to turn here first aspect to you and talk a little bit about this, because obviously the elections were triggered by the war and Armenians' loss in the war, and a lot has been said about the domestic reasons for Pashinyan's win or Kotchikian's loss, potentially connected with the personality of Robert Kotchikian himself, but there were other, of course, reasons as well. But there's something else I would want to focus on, mostly on the connection between the conflict and the elections. The assumption for many 20-30 years has been that Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict in general is very central to Armenian politics. And a party that is weak on Karabakh or loses a war would suffer heavy losses in the elections and lose its popularity. And that seemed to be the assumption also leading up to the elections, why nobody was expecting a victory, let alone, rather decisive victory by Pashinyan. Some form of victory was probably expected. And yet that didn't seem to be the case. Again, Pashinyan won a rather decisive victory. So was the assumption wrong? Does it mean really the conflict and the loss in the war even didn't have as much of an impact on domestic politics as we all assumed it would, or was it something else?
Well, I cannot help but think about a quote from Molotov back in the 50s at a conference in Berlin, where he said, the problem with free elections is you don't know who's going to win. And in this context, I think the elections in Armenia were quite interesting in terms of its unpredictability. Of course, in hindsight, it's always easy to argue or say that, oh, well, the incumbent has never lost in Armenia and so on and so forth. But a couple of quick things about these elections and the war itself. Well, of course, the elections were directly and indirectly triggered by the war and the defeat, Armenian defeat. And it's quite interesting that in the last 3 years, in the last 2.5, 3 years, this is the second snap election. The first one brought Pashinyan to power. And the second one was a question about his legitimacy or his mandate, whether or not how people would look at it. One thing I would disagree, Phil, with your statement that the last 30 years, Karabakh has been a central issue in Armenia, the conflict. Starting in 2003 with Kotchikian's second term, the election, if one were to look at all the platforms presented by the political parties back then, which was also one of the more, well, during the presidential election, but also parliamentary election, Karabakh was relegated to a secondary sort of issue. The challenge since 2003 has always been the issue of the economy, something that Kotchikian played up a lot, and his track record, for whatever reason, circumstances and whatnot, shows that. Now, in terms of the impact of the war itself, I think the overwhelming political forces, or overwhelmingly the political spectrum in Armenia and abroad, in the Armenian world, have been expecting that either Pashinyan would resign and or he would be defeated. And the polls, obviously, lies and statistics kind of a thing. The polls have been showing equal sort of equality or neck and neck sort of competition. But I think to a large extent, the 2003 example of how Karabakh was not an issue might have manifested itself in this election as well. A lot of people bring the false equivalency that Kotchikian's return would mean authoritarianism and so on, and democracy will be dead, but he will provide security. Whereas a lot of Pashinyan supporters would argue that were arguing that no, we are going to provide both and so on. That this is a false equivalency that actually has dominated. And what's fascinating is that poll after poll, when people were actually very hesitant to vote or were arguing that they're not going to vote, at the last moment, they went in droves to support Pashinyan. Now, why? This is, of course, you can't get into the mindset of the average voter, but I think the momentum of change, even though that change, Pashinyan's coming to power and breaking the regime, sort of the continuity of the regime, that momentum, coupled with the existential hatred, if you want to call it, socioeconomically towards oligarchs, and allocated or associated that with Kotchikian. Actually, these are the two reasons why it ended up yielding the results that they did. So I personally was expecting a hung parliament. I was expecting a second round at least, or more parties to come into the parliament. But with this, I think it turns out that Karabakh is not a major factor in the minds of the Armenian electorate. And this is something that needs to be thought about, because otherwise, how would you justify, so humiliating defeat, if you want to call it, for Armenia? And the prime minister, the leader of the country, the head of government, not only stays in power, doesn't resign, yet comes back with almost as a popular mandate as before. Pashinyan's government now, or Pashinyan's party, has now 66% of the seats in the parliament, which is exactly the same as it did in the 2018. So the war itself, it seems to be, while it was the trigger, yet I think it was not in the mind of the voters when they went to the ballots on June 20th.
Thank you, Asbed. Of course, in terms of clear percentage, Pashinyan's party won less share of the vote this time than last time. The equal share, same share that they have in the parliament is connected more with the peculiarity of Armenian election law, which heavily
Absolutely.
privileges the incumbents, but that's kind of different conversation. They lost about what 15-20%, which again they would probably lose in any second election, almost irrespective of the conflict. So that's really interesting. Thank you very much. Let's turn to Zaur. Zaur, so in the aftermath of the war, in the last few months, we've seen two rather contradictory messages coming from Azerbaijan on the special leadership of Azerbaijan. On the one hand, there is a talk of the conflict being over and to normalize, need to open communication roads and what else. Perhaps even more stronger message coming from Turkey in this respect, but we can leave that aside in terms of normalizing with Armenia when Armenia is ready. On the other hand, though, you see a very other type of messages, I'd say aggressive, but diplomatically, let's call assertive messaging from Azerbaijan, which some examples are the presence of a rather large number of prisoners of war, which again more diplomatically are called, I guess, detainees now, but in Azerbaijan can be called terrorists. The encroachment into the territory of Republic of Armenia itself, and without waiting for any kind of demarcation process to play out, trophy park, what else, right? So actually have two tracks, I would say, of in a way reaching out, but also staying very assertive / aggressive. So that was prior to the elections. It's not clear yet what happened after. So what's your thinking about that? So what should we expect in your view, in the immediate aftermath? So what can be the next steps from Azerbaijan, we can see from Baku rather than Azerbaijan? But also what can be the expected grand strategy as a longer term vision that Baku might take in relation to Karabakh, perhaps? It might be harder to answer, up to you, but also in relation with Armenia directly as well.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for these questions. I think the first, you said about the two contradictory messages, the positive and negative, as you described. So about the positive is that the message is that all communication channels should be open, and this there should be a normalization of the relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and it means that in the long term, mid-term and the long term, the Azerbaijan and Armenia is going to know each other, and they will accept their existence. So I'm not saying that they will live together, but they will accept that existence of other nation. So it's a first step for good neighboring relations. But when we back before the war, I think it was a different strategy. It was expected that the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict would have a positive impact to Azerbaijan and Armenia interstate relations, like the diplomatic missions will open, and and the borders will open, and etc. So right now, I think this now expectation is that these communication channels will have a more positive impact also to the peace process, the final peace process. So this is the positive part. The second, the negative part, yes, there are very nuances that actually the rhetoric is not, let's say, adding positive message for further relations. I think we can say there are many reasons. The one reason is that I think the 9 November statement, because in the 9 November statement there are many articles that is actually very ambiguous, and each side actually interprets this the statements in different ways. Especially the security provisions of this the 9 November statement is very, I will say, the weak or a little bit unclear, and also so the responsibility given to the Russian peacekeepers in this area is more than the Russian peacekeepers can carry on. So this security provisions in this area is the ultimate, let's say, concern here in Baku. So I would like to add that what I'm telling here is that the perception I see in Baku, it's not a, let's say, the personal opinion, it's not a, let's say, opinion of the crisis group here. So this, so that's why this was until the election period. I think so. Some people in Baku sees the election results, or before the election as a, let's say, referendum for peace or war. This was the, let's say, perception in Baku. that if the Nikol Pashinyan is going to win, so this will be the win, peace party will win, or others will win. This would mean that let's say the war party will be in Armenia. So this is, I think, that also this is a little bit the minds, I would say. So this is not a good how to say interpretation of the situation. But I think we saw in Baku there was a strong strong opinion about this, that the old regime, the return to the government, will have a more negative impact to the process rather than having the current government. So long-term strategy, I will say that the first strategy in the next 2 years is just to rebuilding these territories and the return of the IDPs. So this is the ultimate goal, and all energy and resources will be let's say will be spent to this area rather than looking to the, let's say, the peace process or final peace process. So the priority area is that the internal one. So then I think then it comes let's say second issue is about more formal talks, more discussions about this the final peace. So repopulating this area is ultimate goal. Return of displaced people also been displaced to their homes is a goal. So, but at the same time, so what lacks here is that also there should be a kind of formula to discuss, not a formal, it might be informal, the local population and the local Armenians and Azerbaijanis to find a common ground in Karabakh. So this will they will see this how the necessity of this might be 1 year later, 2 years later. But I think for now, starting this process would be the good. But so that's why it's hard to say that what is the grand strategy. So I think we will see some elements of this if there will be such strategy in coming weeks and months. So might be tone they will change ultimately. So there will be much more because before my final let's say the word is that before there was a people were unsure that whether who will be in the government. So also this you know that in this region the people see this interstate relations also some investment. So investment of the time, investment of the diplomatic resources. So why you should invest to the wrong side? So this was the perception also. So it's not only about Armenia; it's also about with the all neighboring nations.
Phil, if I may, it's quite interesting that Zaur mentioned about the war or peace party, right, which is a reminiscence of the 1998. When there was going to be a lot of pressure, there was a lot of pressure on then President Petrosyan, and he wrote peace, saying, you know, war or peace, where he actually was presenting himself as the party of peace, and Kotchikian, who was not prominent at the time, as the party of war. So to what extent is in the mindset? You know, this is an interesting question, that in the collective mindset of people in Azerbaijan, or probably in Armenia as well, that this is like, it's a flashback or basically a trip back 23 years now, 23 years ago, a discussion about war or peace and choosing the partner that you would work with. And what would a peace president or a peace leader versus a war leader, you know, offer that already Azerbaijan didn't get through war?
Asbed, so I do have a question about the expectations, which I think
I see. Okay.
In conversation. No, but just to be on the same kind of page, let's say, let's for a second go back to the question of what do you think Armenians expect from Armenian leadership in the immediate future and strategically. And I think it's even more complicated question, frankly, than Azerbaijan. I think in Azerbaijan, more or less, you can see the trajectory of where the government is going or has been going. In Armenia, post-election, at least, there has been essentially no foreign relations strategy of any form.
Even pre-elections, even you didn't have a forum.
I will leave that aside. I think it's a much longer conversation on its own. Yeah, why it's on. But certainly post-election, it was much more focused on managing political crisis at home, right? And it was very reactive when it comes to foreign policy, especially when it comes to relations with Azerbaijan. So, what would you, as an observer, what can be expected from Yerevan immediately? And is there any strategy that we can expect to see?
Well, I think the current government, and I have to mention here is that when we talk about Armenia, even though, unlike in 1993, if I'm not mistaken, with during the Karabakh War, the first Karabakh War, now we can refer to first and second, which triggered a political change in Azerbaijan, and Haydar Aliyev came to power and through a coup, and then it was legitimized through elections. Armenia didn't witness that. This is one of the probably the only bright side in this whole election process. The reason why I mention this is at least the country seems to be political security-wise stable internally, okay? Now, the question is, in the last 2 years or so, especially with COVID, Pashinyan, Prime Minister Pashinyan has expressed or has shown marks of a person who actually is a single leader or a single decision maker, which raises the question as to what institutions, or if at all there's an institution of foreign policy needed in Armenia moving forward, or is it going to be Pashinyan taking on the weight and the decisions all by himself, along with the responsibilities? Probably he is drunk with the success. He might be ecstatic because of the success that I have mandate. So why go ahead and create any strategy for that? The fact that the days prior to the election, the whole staff of the foreign ministry, resigned, and the foreign ministry is operating with very, very limited capacity. The main issue is now here is that, does Pashinyan want to repeat what he did in 2018 and bring in people on whom people whom he trusts, or people who are competent? Because having both is a bit difficult these days. And the tendency back then was that he preferred trustworthiness over competency. Okay. Now the question, the other side is also very important. Who would be willing to work with the current government, right? I think the droves or the resignations that occurred at the foreign ministry or other places, people trying to distance themselves, and also it's a mandate or it's a statement about the style of government, Pashinyan's government, rather than delegating. He is himself thinking that he can do everything. So the question after all of this is that Pashinyan is I don't know if it's a show, it's a facade or not. He's been meeting with extra parliamentary groups that didn't make it to the parliament. He's trying to show that he might be a consensus, although it can easily be a lot of hot air and PR rather than essence. But in terms of what will happen, I think it's going to continue what was happening in the last 6 months. Basically, Armenia taking a passenger side seat, not only in terms of being a guarantor in terms of the Karabakh issue, but also in terms of what it can and it cannot concede to Azerbaijan, be that in terms of the issues of November 9 agreement, as Zaur mentioned, or issues of border demarcation, delimitation, and so on and so forth. It's just going to be a reliable person. In other words, reliable by Moscow, reliable looking at it from Azerbaijan as well. And I don't mean this in any way that they trust him or Pashinyan is Azerbaijan's guy, like many people would say. But he is the defeated leader. He's still in power, and he doesn't have too many cards to play in terms of navigating through the foreign policy, let alone the hardware to be able to do it, the foreign ministry. So here, if we were going to use computer terms, Armenia at this moment lacks the hardware and the software to conduct a foreign policy, not just on the issue of Karabakh, but also on the issue of Armenia's security itself and its future foreign policy as well. So in the coming days, I think the coming weeks would be quite interesting to see the new cadre, if there will be a new cadre appearing in the foreign ministry, be that foreign minister, but also the staff. Negotiators, for instance, back up until 95, 97, 95, 96, 97, there were special negotiators on Karabakh in both Armenia and in Azerbaijan, right? And you had Libarityan was one of them. Gilizadeh was another on Azerbaijan, but it showed to what extent they had focused. This was not just a foreign policy issue, but an existential issue for what that needs to be dealt with. But now, again, that role of negotiation has been relegated to foreign ministers, meetings here and there, and even worse, in the hands of one person, in this case, at least on the Armenian side, Pashinyan. So that is the main challenge. Institutions trying to deal with this issue on an institutional level rather than an individual level. And Pashinyan himself doesn't have the software. I mean, he's not someone who knows about Karabakh conflict in detail. He's not someone who has been involved from the first day. So all of these are components which can make actually him to be more militant maybe sometimes, and he might be unpredictable, as much as the view from Baku is that he can be it's the party of peace, but he can also be an unpredictable sort of counterpart.
All right, so thank you. And that's the important takeaway from what you said. Essentially, the cadre politics, what comes next in terms of appointments, especially in foreign ministry, will show a lot. My analysis actually is similar to yours. I don't think we'll see much of a change, and the focus will be on preference will be given to loyalists, let's say, versus professionalism, which means essentially continuation or perhaps even deepening of the previous kind of one-person rule, especially when it comes to foreign policy. But that brings also us back to the question of expectations that both of you started raising in your previous comments, expectations from each other. I think that's kind of false expectations or miscommunication of expectations was one of the reasons we had the war. Again, not the only reason, of course, but one of the important reasons, because Pashinyan was seen as the peace party also after the 2000 taking power in 2018. There wasn't seem to be an expectation in Azerbaijan that he will be more compromising than Sarkisyan or Kotchikian before him, and he clearly wasn't. Right, so that expectation really raised in Azerbaijan that now we might have a breakthrough on Karabakh that didn't materialize, partially at least pushed the conflict in the direction it went. But expectation in other direction was also perhaps the opposite of it. Armenian side was expecting Azerbaijan to want war or be militant no matter what. So even kind of very obvious from observers' point of view steps by Azerbaijan to de-escalate in 2018, and yes, right after Pashinyan assuming power, even pulling army from the border, and a lot of the escalation that happened rhetorically were seen simply as some form of a trick or manipulation rather than a genuine step towards normalization. So that mismanaged or miscommunicated, let's say, expectations, again, partially at least, didn't allow any peace process to move forward in a constructive way. So now we are in danger potentially of repeating this, and Pashinyan again being seen as a party of peace, which really the only party who campaigned for peace was Petrosyan's party, who didn't get any vote, really. Right, so Pashinyan didn't campaign on peace. I also wouldn't necessarily expect any more pro-peace, let's say, behavior overtly other than whatever he has to concede than in the past. Again, messaging from Baku is maybe even more confusing than it was in 2018. In 2018, it was pretty clear that, there was more de-escalation happening, and even that wasn't seen from Yerevan. Now it's much more mixed messaging. So there is even more tendency from Armenia to see only the negative messaging and only see whatever is aggressive or assertive coming from Azerbaijan and not notice anything constructive coming. So again, given this, essentially the continuation, I would say, of a tendency of mistaking Pashinyan for a peace party and seeing only aggressive behavior from Azerbaijan, how can essentially these expectations be managed better potentially, and that might fall on people like ourselves in terms of those not in politics but more in the opinion making sphere, let's say. But how can essentially what's really communicated be translated better, let's say, both to governments and to the public? Does the question make sense? Essentially, the positive messaging from Azerbaijan was never received in Armenian side, I would say, after the 2018, and vice versa. Whatever Pashinyan did, he was perceived as a peace party, although there was not messaging that was coming across. Any thoughts on kind of managing better the expectations or the public relations?
Zaur, you want to take a first shot at it about expectations?
Yes, it's very strange because what we 8 months ago or 9 months ago, we saw this today's the peacemakers as let's say the supporter or the war party. So that in Azerbaijan, that it was perceived the Nikol Pashinyan, and right now he's seen as a peace party. But it's also, let's say, this in comparison, he's a peace party. In comparison with the Robert Kotchikian and the Sarkisyan, So, I mean, a peace party doesn't mean that the Baku is expecting that the Armenian government will accept anything that related to what Azerbaijan is going to propose. But there's one thing is clear in Baku that there are differentiated things when it comes to the state relations and when it comes to the conflict. So approach or perception is here is that the Azerbaijan-Armenian state border or issues related to communication is interstate nature. So the Armenia is a counterpart. So Azerbaijan we should deal with Armenia. But when it comes to Karabakh conflict or the Karabakh, so Armenia is not a party. So this is the perception of Baku. So Armenia is not a decisive power. Armenia is not going to make any decision. So the local Armenia seems to be a much more decisive power than the official Yerevan. This is how we saw the perception in Baku. So that's why the peace party that's why when we saw that when Baku said that or someone thinks that he's a peace party, it doesn't mean that they will say that he will make any act about the Karabakh. But it's mostly about this normalization relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, or let's say finding a formula of the border demarcation, and also let's say or other issues related to transport the corridors. So this is the expectation from Baku. So coming to the question that the miscommunication, I think I wouldn't say that is a miscommunication. So is a result of the war or the wars. So this is when we say that if we treat it the reason of this war or other things as just a miscommunication, it will give a wrong message to anyone who is actually following the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So it's not a miscommunication, it might be different expectations. So, and wishing to see, so it was the first time that we saw the escalation, the major de-escalation between Azerbaijan and Armenia during the, let's say, at least 20 years, 25 years, or since, I will say, since 2014, which there was an escalated the Karabakh conflict. So that's why, and it was very quiet time between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But the expectation here was that, let's say, the leader with a mandate can change certain things in the government, in the society. So, but expectation wasn't much with reality. So right now, I think there is a very minimum expectation from the Armenian government. Everything is related to the border issues, and one important issue is the humanitarian issue, is that mine clearance. So the mind maps, humanitarian issue. Unfortunately, how they start might be the question. Should be how they should start. I think they should start with the humanitarian issues. So they should resolve this humanitarian issues as soon as possible. The Armenian detainees and the mind maps. It shouldn't be a part of this. The prisoners of the conflict or prisoner of let's say struggle. So that's why the mine and the issue and the detainees issue should be resolved as soon as possible. So this could give a very good let's say positive message to both societies. And then what should be done, I think. I think there should be there is a need a revolution of the thinking about the peacemaking and peace building area in the conflict from now on. So it doesn't matter what Zaur in Baku is thinking about Karabakh conflict, or what Asbed is thinking about Karabakh conflict, when we compare this to the let's say local Armenians are thinking in Karabakh about conflict, or displaced Azerbaijanis is thinking about conflict. Their voice is much more important than or should be much more important than our voices. So, but they should be at the platform that these two sides should talk and find a formula of, let's say, knowing each other. So I think that who's sitting in Baku or Yerevan or other places, I think they can become nationalistic or the war supporter or let's say peace supporter, but it is not going to change anything. It will have a very minimal impact to this conflict resolution. But so that's why the revolution or terror of change should start with this, let's say, the area that Azerbaijan displaced people will return their homes, and they will become again, let's say, the neighbor with Armenia after 30 years.
Zaur, so since there was a question related to this, let me do this quick follow-up. So there's a question from somebody in the audience. So what do you mean by saying that Baku should start talking and working with Karabakh Armenians. There should be some relationship between, or even Karabakh Azerbaijans with Karabakh Armenians.
Yeah.
Essentially, there is now Kotchikian, yes, or representative president, however you want to call it, of Armenians in Karabakh. So Baku doesn't seem to be in any rush in talking to him. So if not, how do you really work with Karabakh Armenians? So
yeah,
what does it mean? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a dilemma for anyone in Baku, anyone in the government, the place, because on the one hand, you know that you should talk with the local Armenians. So in fact, one interesting fact that is, for example, the Kras Group published a report about the post-war situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. You can find one can find many elements of this, how it's a post-war situation, and you see that there is a necessity of the dialogue between Azerbaijanis and Armenians. So in order to solve the main issues. So when I say that Baku might start or needs to start a talk with local Armenians, yes. On the one hand, it's hard to them to communicate with the let's say de factos in Karabakh, because so they were seen as war criminals because of the war and because of the Ganja blast. So that's why ultimately there is no chance that any officials in Baku could start dialogue with let's say de facto government. But at the same time, I think the preference is much more about the finding formula to talking with the local Armenians, let's say in the local level. So, but in order to do this, there is a need of civil administration. So right now, the President Aliyev has a special representative in two regions, not the whole Karabakh, but there should be a very proper civil administration who's dealing with this the local issues. So then I think the locals in this area should know that how to start to approach and to discuss things. And it shouldn't be the formal process. So there shouldn't be the formal process. It should start with the informal, the talks and the most immediate issues, and then I think it can turn. And one day might be much more the formalized process and much more depoliticized process. So I think that's if one starts thinking about how to start this, I think they can find a way how to start and where to start. I think it should start with this, let's say let's say in Karabakh, where the local Armenians are living and where so they have if they have some problems. So because if they start right now discussing things, I think when 1 year or 6 months later or 2 years later, the majority of Azerbaijan will return back to this region. So then there is a need, they will face a very big the problems that might be. So then I think people will realize more that there is a need to talk with the locals. So if you start this process right now, it might help you how to strategize the things in the future.
I mean, of course, I'm fully in favor of people-to-people relations. Yet I want to also stress that I think this Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Karabakh have been pretty centralized around, and there is a pretty serious social consolidation, especially when it comes to relations with each other. So my little bit worry here is that we might repeat South Ossetia, Georgia scenario. We are repeating it in many respects, in my view, but specifically in the one where Georgian government under Saakashvili tried to kind of create some alternative leadership of South Ossetia and talk with them, and this is potentially a worry that
I think it's not the case. It's not a case here because I think there was a Karabakh Azerbaijan community, so it's not longer exist. So I think a few months ago, they decided to dissolve themselves. So that's why this community approach is not a relevant issue in Baku. Yes, I think one thing I should stress that it's very important that sometimes when we use the word the dialogue or discussion, many people say that there is no trust. Then what we are talking about and what we are going to discuss. I think this approach must change in the minds of people, decision makers, and states. I think the states like the people speak and engage in dialogue to build trust. If there was a trust, there would be less need for this dialogue. So I think this is very relevant in our region that people are, let's say, making a much more empowering the trust issue more when it comes to this, let's say, the dialogue.
I would, yes. One second,
Okay,
Phil. I do need to comment about a couple of the things before we go on a tangent. First of all, I think it's very important to keep in mind about the issue of expectations and misrepresentation and whatnot. I think on both sides, there's always a mismatch. There's always like a wires crossing each other without actually understanding what are the messages being sent. I think looking at, even if it was not too obvious, but in 2018, Azerbaijan was willing to wait to see what's going to happen next with the new government. But then they grew restless because, especially as things started escalating by Pashinyan's more sort of non-conciliatory sort of rhetoric. The question then would have been, when do you understand each other's expectations? When do you understand each other's messages? One of the other problems I see now in Azerbaijan, I don't see it, but the way I interpret it is that the language that is coming out of Azerbaijan is still the language of the defeated, is still the language of pre-2020, September 2020, in many, many respects. Azerbaijan itself, the rhetoric or the language that is coming out needs some time to recalibrate, let's call it that way. That, okay, we're not going to be talking in terms of the same languages that Armenians have occupied this and that and that and that and so on and so forth. So now from that perspective, confidence building measures and so on, a rose in any other name is a rose, right? A dialogue in any other name is a dialogue. But I think we practitioners and academics and people in the field and so on, we put so much emphasis on these grand words. Dialogue, we love each other, we're going to live in a beautiful world together and so on and so forth. But the mundane is what matters. The mundane is where things get done. And by mundane, I mean villagers, Armenian and Azerbaijani in Karabakh, for instance, having to share a well, or, a land and so on and so forth. They would most probably be able to find a modus vivendi. They would be able to find some kind of a compromise to get things done. They don't care about high politics and so on. And this, I think, in a large extent, and I think this is what's also, we had talked about this earlier, Zaur, and you mentioned it, is what people on the ground are going to be doing, and to what extent Baku or Yerevan less so because it doesn't have any agency there, but Baku or Moscow would be pushing on the ground. So how can you create those sort of interactions at a regular level? It's not about peace building, conflict resolution. It's about getting my freaking field water, getting my freaking sheep or cows, some prairies and so on and so forth. And in this case, my concern, it's a double-edged sword. My concern is the Russian peacekeepers can act both as a cushion, as a bumper, but can also be a flashpoint. Because since you have closer interaction, possible close interaction between Armenian and Azerbaijani villagers or people in Karabakh, and under the watchful eyes of Russia, of Moscow, it can easily be also create, or there might easily high possibility, quite a good possibility of, let's say, runaway, renegade groups on both sides who might try to infiltrate the other side and, burn a village or burn or steal cows and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do you balance this? How do you not make that a flashpoint for a potential conflict? And focus on more, what do the people on the ground think? In history, there's always that thing. I was talking about this earlier with a friend, is that we always talk grand politics. During the French Revolution, this happened, that happened. But what was an average French citizen thinking, French subject thinking at the time? Can we look at history, conflict, from the perspective of an individual on the ground? But Howard Zinn, the prominent historian, late historian, he has done some kind of a work on this, like people's history of the United States, people's history of the world, looking at history from that perspective. So now the solution has to also be from the people, not people-to-people diplomacy, not track two, but really the people who are living on the ground, on the spot.
So that very much connects with some of the questions that are coming in. The questions being around, is it too early to talk, or who to talk to, who exactly is talking to whom, and what are the expectations? Specifically, a couple of questions came in this direction that are, how can Armenian trust the messaging coming from Azerbaijanis or Baku, however you want to interpret that, and who is these ordinary Azerbaijanis. Yeah, where do you meet them? Or who are the ordinary Armenians? How do you meet them? So how exactly do you see this happening, essentially, given the whole militarization of the region and how much really it has been centrally controlled so far by the authorities? So it's not really a region where people live in mixed neighborhoods, as we have, let's say, in Bosnia or in some other conflicts. We are completely segregated. So any thoughts on that? How can we really move forward with people to people? Yes, grassroots really dialogue, let's say, given the whole securitization of the area.
I think can I say something? So Asbed actually very let's say showed a very gloomy picture about what could happen bad, what could happen. So the very negative let's say scenario. So might be it's good to start. Might be in scholarly work it's good to start with negative, but in reality life I think people should find the common ground to start the things from scratch. So my understanding is that I think it's my expectation or experience that I experienced this in the while working on this issue and also while visiting the different areas, and I saw that so the people actually who is living very close to the conflict, I will say, so they are actually much more they understand better issues than anyone let's say living in the capital. So I think, as you said, Asbed, I think they will find a common ground how to solve the problems. But yes, there could be a very the tensions and flashpoints, but we cannot, let's say, we cannot overcome this by thinking this the bad scenario. But where they should start, I think, immediately might be in the border areas. So I think this there were many ideas.
Border areas, Zaur, you mean Armenia-Azerbaijani border?
Armenia-Azerbaijani border, especially. So you know that before the war, or even one of the flashpoint of the fighting was in the July in the Tavush. So I think the communities, border communities, actually also. It was a very painful process for them for years. So it's not only Karabakh, but it's also the border region. So especially the impact to the harvesting season, the agriculture work. So might be the much more focus should come, or the much more support the international actors should start with this international border areas to find a common, let's say, easing tensions in this area, and also helping the local people to start might be to talk to each other and to receive and might be to share the water. So I think the water issue is also a very important issue in this border area. So might be not to start everything with Karabakh, but to start with the border areas, let's say, to find a common language with Azerbaijan and Armenians, and also this can be a very good example in this direction.
But Zaur, I think, again, thinking out loud here, I get the point that you're saying that, you can build confidence building on an issue that is not as polarizing as Karabakh, for instance, the border issues. Yeah. But then at the same time, in order for you to work, how would you even get to that point about discussing border issues and whatnot to have that trust? Like who would take, what initiative would be taken? Because there's still that mistrust, right? The question would be, would one of the sides has to take, and I'm guessing, and this is not the burden of proof, or this is not the putting the the burden on Azerbaijani side, but technically Azerbaijan is the one who has to take the first step because it's the winning side. It has the upper hand. So in order to make the other side less or more comfortable to dealing with this, to start that process. And the question would be, as I mentioned earlier, about rhetoric, right? But is there also a shift in mentality, or are we seeing a shift in policymakers' mentality in Azerbaijan, in Baku, that, okay, we might be willing to make small compromises here and there? Because that is the starting point, I think, for the rest that you mentioned. So just a
I do agree with you, Asbed. So, but I think certainly there is such thinking that, okay, there should be the process. So there should be the process about, let's say, negotiations, about some process on the ground, but it should come as a joint process. So that's with one small. So that's why, in this regard, I think the international actors can play a much more decisive role rather than Azerbaijan and Armenia. So I think that there is a culture in this region especially might be among the decision makers, they never tell what they want. So even the public, so someone should.
You have to guess, right?
Yes, yeah, no. Someone should offer this as the policy formula. So it might work better. So I think this can come from the international actors. But so I do, and also I would like to add, when I say that dialogue, I'm not talking about dialogue track 2 process or track 1.5. So or the 20 people are meeting to each other and knowing each other, and so saying that everything will be fine. So this is not working. So this history of this conflict proved that this is even those people who knew each other before the war, I think that during the war this ruined their relationship, their friendship, or their in discussion. So they're not discussing or talking to each other. So I think there should be much more the bigger format, or let's say that the ordinary people's thinking should people take into account in this regard, rather than the academicians, scholars, and others. So, but it should be so the academician opinion people or other journalists should be opinion makers. So they should actually drive the society into the right direction. So in the dialogue. So that's why, yeah.
Thank you. So just to fix a few things that again, both of you kept saying that it's an important point that a lot of focus should probably go to smaller humanitarian questions, of course, people to people who live actually next to each other, relationships, and the specific humanitarian issues to be dealt with are the detainees, mines, water sharing, and then from there on something can be built upon potentially. So these couple of things that I took as important. But since you already mentioned internationals and a lot of the questions from the audience were in this direction, let me ask a question there. And a lot of the audience members are also here. I see, in addition to Armenians-Azerbaijani, also from international community. So any thoughts a bit more on that? Well, you started, maybe you finish, and then we turn to Asbed, as in how do you see the role of international actors in any form, moving forward? So essentially everything we knew until now doesn't seem to apply anymore.
Yeah, I think if you ask this question differently, who are the key player, and why do you expect what to expect from this key player? I think this answer to this question is both easy and difficult. If you ask 100 people unaware of this process, they will answer that it's Russia. The easy answer is Russia. The difficult answer would be somewhat hypothetical question of whether the parties would want Russia. The Russian monopoly on everything, including humanitarian issues, but it's also undesirable to turn this issue into a geopolitical competition in order to break Russian monopoly. And this does not seem to be beneficial, at least at this point from Baku. So in other words, instead of replacing Russia with someone else, or let's say it's desirable that Russia eventually share its issues with the Western partners. So the key partners, international or the groups could be the Minsk group. But Minsk group co-chairs or the Minsk group, the participating states. So when we say about the Minsk process, actually, we shouldn't be limited to 3 co-chairs. We should actually enlarge this, at least not informally, but at least in our understanding in the policy making, that these other countries should involve this process, like the Sweden, I don't know, Germany, the Turkey, and other countries. So I think there should be some formula, an informal formula, at least that the key actors should discuss things. But one thing is that is often people ask in Baku that what Minsk groups could play a role. What kind of the Minsk groups the role we would like to see in the future, at least in this the final peace process. So I think the Minsk group, I think, should change, let's say, the policy lines about the conflict. So they are repeating the things that actually is not a new reality, especially after the war. So when you type this the Minsk group in the Google, and you can find the mandate of the Minsk group, it says that Minsk group will be assessed as a successful entity or the process if there will be a Minsk process, Minsk conference, the peace conference between Baku and Yerevan, and also as a part of the peace deal, there will be multinational peacekeeping force in Karabakh. So these two issues is not relevant anymore. So that's why we can assess that the Minsk group is failed. So based on their own, let's say, criteria.
I would say failed miserably, but
yeah,
I'll take the
so
failed part.
that's why I think that in order to see the much more international engagement, I think they should change the policy lines. So first 2 years, might be 3 years, should focus more about stabilization situation first on the ground. So discussion on the issues that are related to I would say, impact to the life of the people, both Azerbaijan and Armenians. And this, let's say, we can say this is a and also joint projects, supporting joint projects about the water, energy, and other things. So, and the final is that it is mentioned in this the 9 November ceasefire agreement about the role of the UN agencies, but we never see the any discussion about this when UN agencies will work in this region and how they are going to help let's say, displaced people return. So that's why. So in short, I think there should be some new formula, new policy lines by especially Western partners. I think the Russian role is clear from their own point of view, the Kremlin standing, so they don't need, how to say, the other. And also I think it also indicates that they would like to share at least some humanitarian things with this other the actors.
I would just add one more thing. I would just want one more thing about what Zaur was saying. I mean, I personally don't think that the Minsk group in any format is relevant anymore, because the relevant parties or the interested parties are already involved. Russia and Turkey are already not only are involved, but have boots on the ground, literally. So I think from that perspective, if you have especially Russia and Turkey not interested in relegating any role to the OSCE, although I have to mention that Lavrov did insinuate at some point, or Moscow has insinuated that, okay, you know what, you guys, OSCE, you're just going to come in and bring money, do some construction, as you said, project and so on, which is not an insignificant sort of role. It has some significance, but as a political process, I think it is beyond that. And one thing I also, Zaur put it as a question, and I want to deepen it a bit more, is about how to look at the processes in regional actors in this case, Iran to a lesser extent, but mainly Turkey and Russia, because I sometimes see analyses that are just plain silly in terms of that, will they, won't they, Moscow and Ankara, will they fight over Karabakh or not? Will they fight over Azerbaijan or not? I think the reason why we didn't see Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh for the last 20 years or so is exactly what Zaur also mentioned, that neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan, were interested in having that. And by the same token, I might go a step further, and also, again, it would open a whole can of worms, but I don't even think that Azerbaijan would be interested in having a strong Turkish presence in the country, regardless of how close of a relationship they have or alliance they have. It's one thing to be close allies. It's another thing to be influenced heavily by them. So international, I think it's more about regional. I argue, and I have argued, that this has become a regional endeavor between Turkey, Russia, and Iran as regional powers, outside players. And if you want to also consider Georgia as an outside player in this conflict, but also within the region, although I think Georgia is quite marginalized in many respects after this war.
All right, thank you, Asbed. And I want to thank the audience as well. We are kind of coming to the end of the time. I think it was an interesting discussion. Of course, many more questions raised than answers, but it's to a degree inevitable at this stage. To the audience, I didn't read your questions, folks, verbatim, but I tried to summarize them and incorporate into the topical discussions. So that way, I believe we touched most of the topics raised. Perhaps we could go a bit deeper into Turkey, but again, another time. We don't have any next webinar planned at this point. We decided to go a bit more slow and react to the situation, see what's relevant, as opposed to kind of preconceived topics. So stay tuned. We will probably come up with one for late July or early August, but we want to see how the situation develops before we decide on the topic and the speakers. So Asbed, Zaur, thank you very much one more time for a very nuanced and
Thank you, Phil.
discussion.
Thank you, Zaur.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.